Really appreciate both for joining us.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, a petition signed by more than 43,000 people has been presented to Parliament seeking to hasten the closure of the live sheep export trade to the Middle East. The petition was organised by the RSPCA and enthusiastically championed by a group of Labor MPs along with a crossbencher this morning. The MP who led the charge here in Parliament House was West Australian Josh Wilson, the member for Fremantle, joined us earlier. Josh Wilson, welcome back to the program. When you were announcing your support for this RSPCA petition on live sheep exports, I saw alongside you Tony Zappia, Michelle Ananda-Rajah, Josh Burns and Independent Sophie Scomps. At least speaking for the Labor MPs, does this amount to a backbench revolt?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, the government has made a commitment to responsibly manage a transition out of the live sheep export trade, which is a marginal, outdated and unfortunately recurrently cruel trade. And Minister Watt has been leading that process very well and consultatively. This petition calls on the government now to move towards giving some certainty about the timing which the trade will actually end.
What does that mean? Because as we look at the Department of Agriculture's website, it's in the midst of a consultation process and it clearly states the government is committed to phasing out this trade. The phase out will not take place during this current term of the Australian Parliament. So by when, in your view, or in the minds of these petitioners?
Well, I think as soon as possible, and that needs to be done sort of sensibly and reasonably. There are a number of stakeholders involved in getting to that point. What the petition calls on the government to do, though, is to provide certainty in the form of that date or that clear timetable by which the trade will end, and that point should be given, I think, in this term. That's pretty reasonable. The Minister expects, I think, to receive the report from the expert panel by the end of this month or perhaps early in October. We'll then need some time to consider what that has to say, but you'd think that that would then be the basis on which that next step would be taken. Some sort of timetable would be adopted that would give clarity as to when the trade will actually come to an end.
OK, so you want the naming of a date, for want of a better description. You want that in this Parliament. What's your concern, though, about the current wording not in this current term? Do you fear that without locking in this Parliament a date, the trade may not finish next term either? It might still be 5 or 6 years away.
No, I mean, I don't have that concern, but I share the view of thousands and thousands of Australians, more than 43,000 who signed the petition. I suspect that there are probably a few 100,000 more across the country that would support the movement towards the end of the trade as soon as possible. So having that kind of clarity and certainty, it's actually good for the industry. It's good for all involved. You don't want it to be a wishy-washy thing going on forever and ever. And so I guess that the community that cares about animal welfare is simply encouraging the government to take that next logical step and provide that certainty.
Now, I think all of the MPs I named at your media event this morning are from city-based electorates. What about the other side of this trade, though? Will farmers, or should they be left worse off by the cessation of this trade? In other words, should government compensate them when that day comes?
Well, it'll be for the Minister to determine exactly how the transition occurs, and he's still waiting for that expert panel report that's going to guide how he does it. I think the substance of your question is about the impact of the end of the trade, and the context is important. I mean, this is a trade that is declined by more than 92% already. Now, some have made some fairly hysterical claims from time to time about how, as this trade winds down, which it pretty much substantially has done, that there would be a reduction in the sheep flock in Western Australia. That hasn't occurred. It's pretty stable at about 14 million sheep. There were claims about widespread job losses. It's declined by 92% already, and that hasn't occurred. So this is about managing a transition that's been underway for some time, and most importantly, it's about bringing to an end a practice that has resulted in animal welfare abuse, animal welfare failure on a consistent and often on quite a severe basis.
Your concern is very much based and directed at the sea-based trade, which is obviously capable of moving large numbers of animals. It does leave open, though, the possibility of aviation-based live sheep trade. Is that feasible? Do you see that happening?
Well, I think if you think about the kind of the costs involved and the circumstances, it's pretty unlikely that we would see that shift. I mean, again, I come to the fact that we've seen over the last 20 years the trade in live sheep go from more than 6.5 million to fewer than 500,000. So that very, very significant decline has already occurred. Parallel to that, we've seen a big surge in the export of children frozen meat, including by air freight. And that trade is worth 50 times more in export terms than the live sheep trade. So I think we already see the trajectories in play. One is a very, very significant and serious decline to essentially a marginal, unnecessary and cruel trade in the form of live sheep export by sea, and matching that, this massive shift towards a humane, sensible, higher jobs and higher value trade in the form of children frozen meat exports, that's pretty much what we're going to see continue. It's just that that final piece needs to be managed properly, and the Albanese Labor government is doing it.
Are you sure it won't cost jobs in your own electorate?
Well, if it's declined by 92% already and we haven't seen those kinds of claims, I mean, people have said that it will literally result in a decrease in the size of the WA sheep flock. It was 14 million 10 or 11 years ago. It's 14 million today.
All right, why don't we just move on? I think this is our first opportunity to talk, Josh Wilson, since the ALP National Conference. You were heavily involved in debate there over AUKUS. That was resolved, as expected, I suppose, on the floor of the conference. Is this the end, though, of your own resistance to this project? Will you continue to come back to it in this Parliament or at future forums of the Labor Party?
Well, I think the starting point is that Australia's national security is in a much better position now, 15 or 16 months on from the election of the Albanese government than it was before, because this government takes seriously our engagement with the world in all of the appropriate form. So not just defence, but also diplomacy, development assistance and trade. And I 100% endorse that, and I 100% support the ministers who are responsible for that work. I have raised some questions and concerns about the acquisition of nuclear-propelled submarines based on my engagement on those topics since I was elected and before I was elected to this place. And I think it's healthy that parliamentarians, particularly backbench parliamentarians like myself, are able to raise those concerns, because that's how, as a democracy, we get to the best kinds of decisions that we can make.
Yeah, well, you've certainly got consistency on your side, and I suppose to my question, that wouldn't mark the end of it, though. You'll continue to make your contributions in other fora.
Well, we're talking about an arrangement, if you just think about the submarine arrangement, that is going to be part of life in Australia for the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So I would hope that I'm not the only one who's going to continue to look closely at aspects of this arrangement. I mean, the ministers themselves will do that, but so should others in the Parliament, in the public domain, in academia and in the broader community. That's the basis on which Australia as a democracy proceeds in the healthiest, most robust way.
Too right, particularly when you take on these multi-billion-dollar, multi-year endeavours as that one is. Josh Wilson, really appreciate your time today. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Greg.